A single text message shattered Emily Carter's world. Her husband of 12 years drained their bank account and fled with a 20-year-old mistress, laughing as he typed, "Ha ha." But what if the real shock wasn't his betrayal, but the secret she'd buried under her bed for years, waiting to strike back? With her boutique empire on the brink of flames and a courtroom battle that could end in blood, one question burns. Who's truly playing who? Hit subscribe now and join us to 1,000 subscribers. Don't miss the twist that'll leave you speechless. The silver bell above the door of silver threads jingled as Mrs. Larson shuffled out, clutching her neatly wrapped silk dress in the boutique's signature silver paper. Emily Carter, 38, stood behind the counter, her chestnut hair pulled into a tight bun, her hazel eyes tracking the older woman's slow exit. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in Chicago, the kind where the hum of Michigan Avenue traffic barely seeped through the boutique's thick glass windows. Then her phone buzzed on the counter, a sharp, insistent vibration that cut through the stillness. She glanced down, expecting a supplier update or a customer inquiry. Instead, a single text message shattered her world. "Leaving you for Miami with Sophie, 20 years old. I've emptied our joint account. Haha." Her husband? Daniel Sullivan. Dan. Her husband of 12 years. Emily's fingers hovered over the screen, steady as stone, though her eyes tightened like a seamstress pulling a thread too hard. The ha-ha hit her like a slap, a cruel punctuation to a life she'd thought was stitched together with trust. She didn't scream, didn't drop the phone. Instead, she typed back, her nails clicking against the glass. "Good luck." Then she locked the screen, slid it into her apron pocket, and turned to adjust a rack of cashmere sweaters, her lips pressed into a thin line. To anyone watching, she was just a boutique owner tidying up. But inside, a storm brewed, one she'd seen gathering for months. The signs had been there, subtle at first, then glaring like neon billboards. Dan's late nights at the office that never matched his pay stubs. The sudden password change on his phone 6 months ago, brushed off with a laugh, just keeping the hackers out, The way he'd started hitting the gym, buying skinny jeans and cologne that smelled like a midlife crisis, all to mask the softening middle he'd earned at 45. 3 months back, she'd found a receipt in his jacket pocket. $200 at La Belle Vie, a swanky restaurant downtown. Dated for a night he'd claimed to be working late. That same evening, Emily had opened a secret account at a different bank, quietly siphoning her personal savings while leaving just enough in their joint account to keep him complacent. About 2 months' worth of deposits. He'd known something was coming. But this was a dagger, not a drift. The boutique closed at 6, and Emily locked the door, the click echoing in the empty space. She walked home. Her home. Inherited from her grandmother. A brick townhouse on a quiet street in Lincoln Park, its deed stubbornly in her name, despite Dan's years of nagging to add his. Another instinct that had paid off. In the bedroom, she knelt by the bed, her knees sinking into the plush rug, and pulled out a small wooden box Dan had once told her to toss. "Just junk, Em. Get rid of it." She'd kept it anyway, a nagging gut feeling she couldn't shake. Now, with trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed at the edges, written in Dan's jagged scrawl. They were addressed to S, dated back 2 years. "I'll give you the world, S. We'll leave her behind, start fresh. She's too busy with her little shop to notice." Emily's breath caught, a sob clawing up her throat. 2 years. Not months, not a fling, 2 whole years of lies while she'd cooked him dinners, laughed at his dumb jokes, and built silver threads into a name people whispered with awe. She sank to the floor, clutching their wedding photo from the nightstand. Her in white lace, him with a goofy grin, a man she barely recognized now. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and silent. Was I blind? Did I let this happen? The room spun with self-doubt, but then her eyes hardened. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood and grabbed her phone. Her lawyer, Karen Walsh, picked up on the second ring. "Emily, everything okay?" Emily's voice was steel. Prep the papers. He just made his move. She had evidence, texts, receipts, bank statements, and now these letters. A paper trail of betrayal that could bury him. But as she hung up, a weight settled in her chest. Could she forgive herself for trusting him so long? Had she missed something bigger? She paced the hardwood floor, the letters scattered like fallen leaves when her phone buzzed again. Another text from Dan. You think you're smart? I've got copies of the boutique's books. Half that shop is mine. Emily froze, her pulse hammering. 5 years ago, when Silver Threads was just a dream in a rented storefront, Dan had helped her log the first year's expenses. She'd been so grateful, so naive. Had she signed something back then? A contract? A slip of paper he could twist now? The boutique wasn't just her business, it was her soul, poured into every silk scarf, every hand-stitched hem. If he had proof, or even a forgery, she could lose it all. Her mind raced. Was he bluffing, or did he hold a trump card she'd forgotten? She sank onto the bed, staring at the letters, the photo, the phone. The man she'd loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd planned this for years. But what if the real shock wasn't his betrayal? What if it was the secret she'd buried under her bed, waiting to strike back? She clutched the box tighter. Whatever Dan thought he had, she'd fight with everything she'd built. Alone, in the dark, Emily whispered to herself, "This isn't over." Emily Carter stood in the dim glow of her Lincoln Park bedroom, the wooden box of Dan's letters still open on the floor like Pandora's chest of betrayal. The clock on the nightstand ticked past midnight, its soft rhythm drowned by the buzz of her phone. Dan's latest text glared up at her. You think you're smart? I've got copies of the boutique's books. Half that shop is mine. Her stomach churned. 5 years ago, when Silver Threads was just a flicker of hope in a cramped storefront off Clark Street, Dan had sat beside her late at night, logging receipts into a clunky spreadsheet. She'd been exhausted, grateful. Had she signed something then? A partnership agreement he could wield now like a knife? Or was it a bluff, a forgery born of desperation? Either way, the boutique, her lifeline, her legacy, was suddenly a battlefield. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the edge of a letter dated July 2023. She's too busy counting pennies to see me slipping away. S. The words stung, but they sharpened her resolve. She grabbed her phone and dialed Karen Walsh again. He's claiming half the boutique, Emily said, her voice low but firm. Says he has proof. Karen's tone was clipped, professional. Send me the text. If it's real, we'll fight it. If it's fake, we'll bury him with it. Emily forwarded the message, then added, I've got more letters he wrote to her, years worth. Karen paused. That's premeditation, Emily. Gold in court. Stay calm. We've got this. But calm was a distant dream by morning. Emily unlocked Silver Threads at 8, the familiar scent of lavender diffuser mingling with the crisp October air seeping through the door. She'd barely hung a new rack of velvet jackets when her phone lit up with notifications. Dozens, then hundreds. A post on X from an anonymous account screamed in all caps. Silver Threads sells sake designer goods. Scam alert. Attached were blurry photos of knockoff purses, nothing like her curated inventory. But the damage was instant. Her inbox flooded with cancellations. I trusted you, Emily. Refund my order now. The boutique's Instagram comments erupted with accusations. Fraud, thief, and by noon, her sales dashboard showed a 40% drop. Dan wasn't just after her money, he wanted her reputation in ashes. Emily's hands shook as she dialed her assistant manager, Lisa. Close the shop for the day. I need to fix this. Then she called the credit card company, her voice ice cold. Canceled 2 first-class tickets to Miami booked yesterday on my joint card, plus a stay at the Royal Palm. Fraudulent charges by my husband, Daniel Sullivan. I've got texts to prove it. The representative's satisfaction leaked through her professional tone. Done, ma'am. He's off the account now. Emily pictured Dan and Sophie stranded at O'Hare, their smug escape unraveling, and a flicker of triumph sparked in her chest. But it died fast. At 2 p.m., the boutique's door swung open, the bell jangling violently. Dan strode in, his too-tight blazer straining over his gym-pumped shoulders, a smirk twisting his lips. Behind him stood a young lawyer in a cheap suit, clutching a briefcase. "Hey, Em," Dan drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Thought I'd drop by before the movers come for my half of this place." And the lawyer stepped forward, sliding a stack of papers across the counter. "Mr. Sullivan has filed an emergency injunction. These documents show he co-owns Silver Threads. Until the court rules, we're requesting the business be sealed for investigation." Emily's heart thudded against her ribs. Sealed? Her boutique? Her sanctuary? Locked up like a crime scene? She scanned the top page, a contract dated 2020, her signature scrawled at the bottom next to Dan's. It looked real. Too real. Her mind raced back to those early days, bleary-eyed over coffee and spreadsheets. Had she been that careless? Or had he doctored it, stitching her name into his scheme like a master tailor? She met Dan's gaze, his blue eyes glinting with triumph. Sophie hovered by the door, her blonde hair falling over her face, avoiding Emily's stare. "You won't get away with this," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her core. Dan chuckled. "Try me. See you in court, sweetheart." He sauntered out, the lawyer trailing, leaving the papers like a ticking bomb. Emily locked the door behind them, her knees buckling. She slid down the wall, the cool plaster against her back, and dialed Tom Rivera, her old college friend and financial whiz. He met her at a diner an hour later, his dark eyes narrowing as he flipped through the contract. "This signature's yours, Em, but it's off. Too clean. Like it's been lifted from something else. I'd bet my house it's forged." Relief washed over her, but Tom's next words chilled it. "Problem is, proving it takes time. If Dan's injunction holds, they could lock Silver Threads tomorrow. You'd lose millions, maybe everything, before we sort this out." Emily gripped her coffee mug, the heat searing her palms. "I can't let him win, Tom. Not like this." She spent the evening poring over bank records, cross-referencing every deposit, every withdrawal, building her case. The boutique's profits, hers alone, meticulously separated from their joint finances, stared back in black and white. But doubt gnawed at her. What if Dan's lawyer twisted the narrative? What if the court believed him? At midnight, her phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. The message was a gut punch. "Drop the fight or your precious shop burns." Attached was a grainy photo, Silver Threads, at night, a shadowy figure holding a Molotov cocktail by the front window. Emily's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she dialed 911, MWI store. "Please, send help." The operator promised extra patrols, but as Emily sat in the dark, the photo seared into her mind. She felt the walls closing in. Dan wasn't just playing dirty, he was playing with fire, literally. Was he desperate enough to burn her world down? Or was this a new player, someone she hadn't seen coming? She hugged her knees, the boutique's fate, and her own, hanging by a thread. One thing was clear, this wasn't a divorce anymore. It was a war. Emily Carter sat alone in her Lincoln Park townhouse, the grainy photo of a Molotov cocktail glowing on her phone screen like a death warrant for Silver Threads. The clock struck 2 a.m., the silence broken only by the faint wail of a siren somewhere in Chicago's restless night. She'd called the police hours ago, and they'd promised extra patrols around her boutique, but the words felt hollow. That shadowy figure in the image, hood up, bottle in hand, could strike any moment, turning her life's work into a pile of charred silk and ash. Her fingers hovered over the phone, debating whether to call Tom again. When it rang, instead, the caller ID read, Margaret Sullivan, Dan's mother. Emily hesitated, then answered, her voice tight. "Margaret, it's late. What do you want?" A sob crackled through the line. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would come to this." Margaret's voice broke, and Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "Come to what?" Another sob, then words tumbled out. "Dan's in deep trouble. He's been gambling online for years. Lost everything borrowed from loan sharks. Sophie left him yesterday when she found out. He's desperate, Emily. He needs the boutique money to pay them off, or they'll kill him." Emily's breath caught, her mind reeling. Gambling? Loan sharks? This wasn't just betrayal. It was a collapse she'd never seen coming. She sank onto the couch, the phone trembling against her ear. Why are you telling me this? Margaret's plea was raw. Don't sue him, Emily. I know he's wrong. I know he hurt you. But he's my son. If you take everything, he's dead. Please. Emily's throat tightened, a storm of emotions crashing through her. Part of her wanted to scream Dan had emptied their account, threatened her business, her life, and now she was supposed to save him. But another part, softer, flickered with guilt. Margaret had always been kind, baked her pies, called her daughter. Could she let a mother lose her child, even one as vile as Dan? Sleep eluded her that night, Margaret's words looping like a broken record. At dawn, she drove to Silver Threads, the streets slick with October rain. She'd barely parked when a crash shattered the quiet. A brick sailed through the boutique's front window, glass exploding across the hardwood floor. Emily leapt from her car, heart pounding, and ran to the wreckage. A crumpled note lay among the shards. Last warning, drop it. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground, glass cutting into her palms, blood mixed with rain as she clutched the note, tears streaming down her face. Why me? She screamed into the empty street. Why do I have to pay for his mess? The boutique wasn't just a store, it was her grandmother's dream. Born from stories of sewing dresses in a tiny attic during the Depression, Emily had built it from nothing. Her hands threading every needle, her heart in every sale. Now it lay violated, a gaping wound in the morning light. She pulled herself up, blood dripping from her cuts, and called the police again. Someone threw a brick through my window. It's tied to the threat last night. The officer's voice was calm, detached. We'll send a unit. Stay safe, ma'am. But safety felt like a lie as she stared at the wreckage, the note burning in her hand. Emily called Karen Walsh next, her voice shaking but resolute. They smashed my window. Another thread. I'm not backing down. Karen's tone hardened. This is escalation, Emily. We've got enough to bury him now, texts, letters, and this, but it's dangerous. Are you sure you want to push forward? Emily wiped her tears, the sting of glass in her palms grounding her. If I stop, he wins. I'd rather lose everything standing than live on my knees. But as she hung up, doubt clawed at her. Was this justice worth her life? Worth Dan's? Margaret's sobs echoed in her mind, warring with the image of flames licking her boutique. She spent the day cleaning up, boarding the window with Lisa's help, every shard a reminder of the stakes. Customers whispered as they passed. Heard she's in a nasty divorce, poor thing. But Emily kept her head high, her cuts bandaged, her resolve fraying. At dusk, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Not the threatening one, but a new one. It was Sophie. Emily, I need to see you. I know the truth about Dan. Meet me at the diner on Halstead, 8 p.m. Emily's pulse quickened. Sophie, the girl who'd laughed too loud at Dan's jokes, who'd followed him into this mess. What could she possibly know? Was this a trap or a lifeline? Emily drove to the diner, the neon sign flickering against the wet pavement. Sophie sat in a corner booth, her blonde hair limp, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked younger than 20, fragile, like a bird with clipped wings. Thanks for coming, Sophie whispered, clutching a coffee mug. I didn't know who else to tell. Emily slid into the seat across from her, voice low. What truth, Sophie? What's he done now? Sophie's lip trembled. It's not just the money or the shop. He's lost his mind. I saw him last night. He was screaming at someone on the phone, begging for time. I think he's the one who wants your place burned. Emily's blood ran cold. Dan orchestrating arson? Or was he just a pawn pushed by the sharks circling him? Sophie slid a crumpled napkin across the table. I wrote down what I heard. I'm scared, Emily. He's not the man I thought. Emily unfolded it, scribbled names, dates, a fragment, pay or torch it. Her hands shook. This wasn't just about her boutique anymore. It was life or death. hers and his. She looked at Sophie, searching her face. Ally or liar? The diner's hum faded as Emily weighed her next move, the line between survival and revenge blurring fast. Emily Carter stood outside the diner on Halsted Street, the crumpled napkin from Sophie trembling in her hand. The scribbled words, "Pay or torch it," burned into her mind as the Chicago wind whipped through her coat. Sophie's confession had shifted everything. Dan wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a cornered animal, drowning in debt and desperate enough to burn her world down. Emily drove home, her headlights cutting through the rainy night, her resolve hardening with every mile. She called Karen Walsh from the car, voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Sophie's got proof. Dan's behind the threats. I'm sending you a recording she made. We will end this tomorrow." Karen's reply was sharp. "If it holds up, he's done." "Get some rest, Emily." "You'll need it." Rest was a fantasy. Emily spent the night at her kitchen table, the napkin beside a laptop streaming Sophie's shaky audio. Dan's voice, frantic, pleading with someone. "I'll get the money. Just give me a week. She's got cash in that shop, I swear." Then, a chilling shift. "If she fights, make it disappear. Burn it." The words looped in her ears, each replay tightening the knot in her gut. She gathered her arsenal, texts, letters, bank records, the forged contract, the brick's note, and now this. By dawn, she was ready, her bloodshot eyes fixed on the courthouse steps ahead. The emergency hearing began at 9 a.m., the Cook County courtroom buzzing with tension. Emily sat beside Karen, her bandaged hands clasped tight, the cuts from the shattered glass a silent testament to the stakes. Dan slouched across the aisle, his blazer swapped for a rumpled shirt, his lawyer, a wiry man named Gregson, shuffling papers with nervous energy. The judge, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair, peered over her glasses. "Mrs. Carter, you've requested an injunction against Mr. Sullivan for financial misconduct and threats. Proceed." Karen stood, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, we have evidence of fraud, theft, and attempted arson orchestrated by Mr. Sullivan against my client's business, Silver Threads." The room hushed as Karen laid it out. Dan's text gloating about draining their account, the letters proving 2 years of premeditation, the forged contract Tom had flagged, the brick through the window, the Molotov photo. Then came the knockout, Sophie's recording. As Dan's voice crackled through the courtroom speakers, "Burn it!" His face drained of color, his hands gripping the table. Emily watched him, her heart pounding, not with triumph, but with a raw, jagged ache. This was the man she'd once loved, now a stranger, unraveling before her eyes. Gregson leapt up, his voice shrill. "Your Honor, this is a setup. My client admits to rash decisions. The account, the tickets. But these threats? Unsubstantiated. Mrs. Carter's out for revenge, fabricating evidence to ruin him." Karen didn't flinch. "Fabricating? We have witnesses." She nodded to the back, and Sophie stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The gallery murmured as she took the stand, her voice trembling but clear. "Dan forced me to sign fake papers. He gambled away everything, our savings, loans, he couldn't repay. Last week, he told someone on the phone to burn the boutique if Emily didn't back off. I recorded it because I was scared." Dan shot to his feet, eyes wild. "She's lying. She's in on it with her." The judge banged her gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Sullivan." Emily met his gaze, her voice breaking as she stood. "Your Honor, this isn't about money anymore. It's about survival. He tried to take my home, my business, my life. I'm not here to ruin him. He did that himself." She turned to Dan, tears spilling over. "You thought you could break me, but you forgot I'm not alone." The room stilled, her words hanging heavy. The judge reviewed the evidence, her pen scratching notes. Gregson tried again, desperation creeping in. "Mr. Sullivan was coerced. Loan sharks threatened him. He acted out of fear." The judge's eyebrow arched. "Fear that led to fraud and arson threats? And this contract? Expert analysis shows the signatures forged. Mr. Sullivan, you emptied a joint account, used shared credit for personal gain, and now stand accused of orchestrating violence. Do you deny this? Dan stammered, sweat beading on his brow. I just wanted a fresh start. The judge cut him off. By stealing and endangering others? I've heard enough. Her ruling came swift and final. All shared assets frozen. Mr. Sullivan is ordered to repay funds removed from the joint account within 48 hours. Given the evidence of threats, I'm issuing a restraining order and referring this to the DA for criminal charges. A deputy approached Dan, cuffs glinting. He lunged toward Emily, voice hoarse. You've killed me. Em, they'll come for me now. She flinched but held her ground as he was dragged out, his shouts fading down the hall. Emily stepped outside, the October sun harsh against her tear-streaked face. Karen squeezed her shoulder. You did it. But victory felt hollow. She drove home, replaying Dan's last words. They'll come for me. Had she just sentenced him to death at the hands of those sharks? That night, Margaret knocked on her door, eyes red, holding a letter. He wrote this from jail, she whispered, handing it over. Emily unfolded it, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Thanks for not letting me die out there. She sank to the floor, sobbing. Not for him, but for the weight lifting off her chest. He'd lived somehow, despite it all. Emily Carter knelt on the hardwood floor of her Lincoln Park townhouse. Dan's jailhouse letter crumpled in her hands. Thanks for not letting me die out there, he'd written, the words jagged and faint, like a ghost of the man she'd once known. Margaret had left an hour ago, her eyes hollow with a mother's grief, but her parting whisper lingered. He's alive because of you. Emily's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. Not tears of forgiveness, but of release. The courthouse victory had saved her boutique, her home, her life, but it had also somehow spared Dan from the loan shark's wrath. The police had intervened after his arrest, freezing his debts in a criminal probe. She hadn't meant to save him, yet here she was, crying for a wound she didn't know she'd carried. The next morning, Emily drove to Silver Threads, the boarded-up window a stark reminder of the war she'd fought. Lisa met her there, hammer in hand, and together they pried off the plywood, letting sunlight spill across the glass-strewn floor. A single brick-sized hole remained, taped over with plastic, a scar she'd fix later. Customers trickled in, their whispers softer now. Heard she won. Tough lady. Emily smiled through the ache, ringing up sales with bandaged hands, each transaction a stitch in her healing. By noon, Sophie called. Can we talk? Not about him, about something else. Emily hesitated, then agreed. Dinner, 2 p.m. Sophie sat in the same booth as before, her blonde hair tied back, her face less fragile, more determined. She slid a notebook across the table. I've been thinking, she said, voice steady. What he did to you, to me, it's bigger than us. I want to start something, a fund for women stuck like I was, or fighting like you did. Will you help? Emily flipped through the pages, sketches of a logo, a name, silver resilience. Her throat tightened. This girl, once Dan's pawn, was reaching for redemption. Why me? Emily asked. Sophie met her gaze. Because you didn't break. You showed me what strength looks like. Emily nodded, a quiet yes slipping out, the first thread of hope weaving through her scars. 5 years later, Silver Threads stood transformed, a flagship store in a chain of 5, its silver sign gleaming above Michigan Avenue. October 3030 brought the boutique's anniversary gala, a swirl of champagne flutes and designer gowns under crystal chandeliers. Emily, now 43, stepped to the podium, her chestnut hair streaked with silver, her hazel eyes bright with something fiercer than youth. The crowd hushed. Customers, local reporters, young entrepreneurs. Even Sophie, now a partner in their thriving fund. Emily's voice trembled at first, then steadied. 5 years ago, a text message broke my world. My husband of 12 years stole my money, my trust, and tried to burn this place down. I thought I'd failed, not because I lost him, but because I didn't see him slipping away. She paused, tears glinting in the spotlight. But failure isn't losing someone else. It's giving up on yourself. I stood in this shop, glass in my hands, blood on the floor, and chose to fight. Not for revenge, but for me, for every woman who's been told her dreams don't matter. The room erupted in applause, but Emily raised a hand, silencing them. Tonight isn't just about silver threads. It's about silver resilience, a fund Sophie Miller and I built. We've helped 200 women escape toxic lives, start over, stand tall. That's my legacy. Not his ruin, but our rise. Sophie joined her, their hands clasping, and the crowd cheered again, cameras flashing. As the gala wound down, a figure lingered in the shadows by the door. Emily spotted him. Dan, thinner, grayer, his old jacket hanging loose on his frame. He didn't approach, just watched, his eyes unreadable. She excused herself, stepping outside into the crisp night air. He turned to leave, but she called out, "Dan!" He stopped, head bowed. "I saw the news. 5 stores. You did good, Em." His voice was rough, tired. Emily crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" He shrugged. "Dunno. Guess I wanted to see it for myself." He shuffled off, disappearing into the dark, and Emily let him go. No anger, no pity, just closure. Margaret approached later, her dress a Silver Threads original, her smile faint. "I saw him yesterday," she said, smoothing the fabric. "He's off gambling, living in a little place above a garage. Works odd jobs. He talks about the old days, what he could have had. He doesn't get it. He didn't lose you in court, he threw you away." Emily nodded, her chest light. "Thanks, Margaret." The older woman hugged her, whispering, "You taught us to stop making excuses for him. That's your gift to us." Back inside, a young customer, a girl with wide eyes and a notepad, tugged Emily's sleeve. "How'd you do it? After all that?" Emily smiled, the framed text from Dan. Hanging behind her counter like a trophy. "By believing I was worth more than he thought. You are too." The girl scribbled it down, and Emily felt a ripple of hope spreading beyond her. Silver Threads wasn't just a shop anymore. It was proof that ashes could birth something stronger. Dan's shadow faded from her mind, but his letter stayed in a drawer, a quiet reminder. Through mutual friends, she heard he'd tried dating, failed, his profile still claiming young at heart with an outdated photo. Sophie's fund grew, her own story, once a footnote, now a beacon. Emily stood by the window, watching Chicago glitter below, and whispered to her grandmother's ghost, "We made it." The hole in the glass was gone, replaced by a pane as clear as her future.